Hi, my name's Tim from Fiorucci Fabrications, here with Lowbrow for another Tech Tips video. And today I'll be showing you how to narrow and clean up your bars using this internal throttle housing from Kustom Tech. So for this project, I'll be using the Lowbrow 10-inch T-bars, this internal throttle housing from Kustom Tech, and I'll be using a Barnett throttle cable that has the adjustment located in a different location that works better with the internal throttle. So to get started on this project, you're going to want to have all the parts that you intend to run. We're going to be using this Kustom Tech clutch lever. I already bolted it into the handlebars in a spot where I thought was comfortable for how narrow I want the bars to be. And for the grips, we'll be using these Vans caulk grips. To use the internal throttle, you're going to have to buy 2 of these because both sides of the bar is now 1 inch instead of having the 1 1/16 inch for the throttle sleeve. So you're going to actually hold these up here and get them into a spot where you want them to be, and we only really need to measure for one side because you're going to make the other side match. So since I have the clutch lever that's kind of giving us a standard, we're going to be working off the left side, and I get the grip in a spot to where I can actuate the clutch lever and it feels comfortable. And so all you're going to do is grab your marker and mark a little spot so you know where that grip's going to end up. So it gives us a spot to figure out how short the bars are going to end up. When narrowing your handlebars, you don't always want to measure just from the ends because some bars might not always be equal left and right. So it's good practice to measure from your risers or some center point depending on what kind of handlebars you have. And just give a quick check to make sure that the top bar is actually centered in your riser. And we're using lowbrow bars, so of course they're dead on. So we can actually measure from the end of the bar and cut an equal length off of both sides and they will be the same length. So we're going to be cutting 2 7/8 off of the left side, but to cut the right side, since we'll be using the internal throttle, we actually have to cut a little bit more so that the end of the internal throttle housing actually ends up at that 2 7/8. So you can mark your 2 7/8 on this side and then just hold up your housing to that mark and then take your marker and mark to the edge of the step of the slug to where that's going to end up on the handlebar. And now we know where we're going to cut, and after you have your mark on there, you want to hold up your throttle and make sure that you have enough straight in your handlebar for this sleeve to slip inside because it gets bolted on the inside of your handlebar. So you have a couple different options of what handlebars you can run this on, actually more than just a few. We're putting them on T-bars today, but another good candidate for this setup would be a set of rabbit ears because the bar actually bends and is the same piece all the way down to where it bolts onto your top tree. So you could actually have the throttle cable come right out of the bottom, right above your top tree and route under your gas tank, and it'll be really clean. On the T-bars, we'll have to actually pop out between the 2 risers. But before you get started on this and start cutting away, it's always good practice to make sure that you have everything you need. If you choose to use the throttle cable that we recommend for the internal throttle housing, you could basically put this thing on apes and you'll be fine. So now that we checked our length, we're going to unbolt the T-bars and get to cutting and start fitting some stuff up. Snakes! Now that you got your bars off, let's get to cutting. These cuts were brought to you by Jet. Keep on cutting. Okay. We did a good job. So now that we have the handlebar cut, the next step would be to fit your internal throttle housing inside the handlebar. You're going to have to measure and make sure that the OD of the internal throttle housing is smaller than the ID, or like a really close fit. So to fit this on the inside, you got to make sure that after we cut this, that you don't have any burrs on the inside of the tubing. And then also, this tubing has a weld seam in it which protrudes into the inside of the bore of the tube. And we'll have to remove that so the slug can slip inside. You only really need to grind away at the tube and just deep enough for this to slip all the way inside the tubing. So let's get to grinding. I roughed out the weld with a carbide bit, and I'm going to switch to just a barrel sander to help smooth this out. And you might just have to open up the hole just a little bit to get everything to slip in nicely. Gotta love that. I love that close-up. Almost there. So now we got the internal throttle housing to fit into my handlebar. You're going to want to take your time and opening up that hole and grinding down the weld seam to get your fit as tight as possible so the throttle housing can't just wobble all around inside the bar. The next step will be locating the hole that we'll have to drill through the handlebar to mount the internal throttle housing to the handlebar. It's a good tight fit. So like I said before, the next step is to put the hole in the bottom of the handlebar for the bolt to hold the housing onto the handlebars. So you'll have to measure from the step to the center of the bolt hole, which I'm measuring at 1 inch, and then measure from the edge of the cut part of the handlebar to the center of the hole to drill your hole. So to lay that out, an easy method, I just grabbed a fat Sharpie from like any store, and use that on there. And then you can use your calipers and set them to 1 inch. This will help you lay out so you have a nice thin line to mark with your center punch. So you're not like have a big fat Sharpie line. And then you can just scribe the edge. And now we will center punch and drill our hole. When laying out your hole, sometimes it helps to actually bolt your handlebars to the bike and then figure out exactly where you want that bolt to come out, whether you want it to be really easy access on the top, more hidden at the bottom. It's really up to you. The depth from the edge of the bar to the center of the hole so it lands in the spot where the threads are on the housing is all that's really important. Okay, so now I'm going to drill my hole. I'm starting with a pilot, and I also have the handlebar clamped in my vise using a set of soft jaws so I don't scratch the chrome, and those are also available at Lowbrow Customs. So I started off with a smaller drill, and now I'm opening up to 13/64, which is just over 3/16, which is what the bolt diameter measures to. After you have your hole drilled, you're going to have to just lightly sand on the inside just to clean up the burrs from the drilled hole to let your housing slip in. All right, now that we have it cleaned up, I'm going to fit this housing inside the bar and put the bolt in. And since we have a tight fitment, you kind of have to guide the housing in straight so that the drilled hole with threads in the housing lines up with the hole that you just put in with the bars, which can be a little tricky. It actually, this might make it easier. Might make it easier if you actually take off the grip. So there's no more moving parts to deal with. Come on, buddy. There you go. And that's going to stay on there. This can be a little tricky to start. You just want to take your time and rotate the housing to make sure that the bolt lines up with the hole as nicely as you can. You definitely do not want to force a screw. And if you take your time and drilled it 1 inch from the flange, there should be no problems with it going in. And now we can put this on. Put that back on. I don't have a screwdriver. And there it is. Now the next thing we're going to tackle is making the cable. Now that we have the throttle housing mounted firmly on the end of the handlebar, we are going to drill a hole in the middle of the bar for the throttle cable to come out and then go down and underneath the gas tank. On T-bars, you can't have the throttle cable actually come out of the riser unless you already drill the corresponding hole in the top of the T-bar, which that's if you were making the T-bars from scratch. Now if you take your throttle cable, and we're going to measure the housing that is actually what's going to be coming out of the top of the T-bar to figure out what size hole to drill into the handlebar. And it's just over, it's basically 3/16 on the nose, so we're going to drill a 1/4 inch hole into the handlebar. We figured out the hole size, and then I just had to figure out where to actually place the throttle cable hole. And since, like I said before, the T-bars, the hole actually has to come out of the top bar. You want to kind of hold up your throttle cable and figure out your routing, and we're going to actually have the throttle cable follow the left side riser of the T-bar, and you can see the black dot I drew into the center of the cross member, and so the throttle cable is going to pop out there and have a nice little curve and follow the left side riser down. And you don't want to put too tight of a kink in this to make it hard for the actual internal part of the cable to slide through the housing. So now that we're marked, I'm going to center punch it, and then we're going to drill our hole. Now that you have your 1/4 inch hole drilled, I like to put the drill back in, and then as the drill is turning, cock the drill bit in the hole so that you don't have to have a sharp 90 of the throttle cable coming out of the handlebar, so it comes out at a nice smooth angle. So we're going to drill the hole now. This is in the way. There we go. So when you're finished, you'll have it at an angle, and when you stick your throttle in, it's able to come out at like a nice smooth angle instead of having to come out perpendicular to the handlebar. After you do this, you're going to have to deburr all the surfaces. You don't want any burrs rubbing on the throttle housing or anything like that. Just make sure you clean it up as best you can inside and out with a tiny little carbide if you can get in there. But do your best with cleaning up that hole. So we bolted the handlebars back on the front end. I removed the internal throttle housing, and I also took off the air cleaner to give us better access to the butterfly on the side. So the next step, I'm going to take the throttle cable and actually hook it up to the carburetor and run it in through the bars, because we need to figure out where to cut the housing to the throttle cable and to fit everything else back on. So you've got to stick your throttle cable in, put it through the butterfly, and then route it through the frame. There we go. Put the wire through the slot in the tower. Put the housing in with your adjuster at the bottom towards the carburetor. And it kind of all depends on what kind of bike, what kind of tank, and how you're going to route this. But you have to make sure, whatever way you route it, that the cable is not actually going to get tension on it when you turn the handlebars left and right. So put it through the hole in the handlebars that we made. And on some bikes, you got to be careful. You don't want your, the fork stops are in different spots on front ends. And you got to make sure that you're not about to smash your throttle cable when you turn your handlebars. You see that pretty common with clutch cables. Okay, get all the tension out of it. And it's also kind of nice, if you can see, we have the adjustment ran all the way in, so that it can be a little loose, and then we're going to actually take the adjustment out after everything's hooked up. I think that's pretty good with it like that. I'm going to make sure I just kind of have this up on a jack. And turn to the right, maybe I'll give it just a little more. Okay, that's about where we're going to be. That seemed pretty good to me. So we have the cable routed where we want it to go, and I checked it left and right, so the cable's not going to get increased tension on it when you turn your handlebars all the way to the right or all the way to the left. So we need to figure out where to cut the housing at. So I can tell easily where the housing lands at the end of the bar. So we're going to put a mark on the housing as reference. Try to get something that's going to stay on, because we actually have to pull the housing back out of the handlebar, so you don't want to wipe off your mark when you're taking it out. So we have that mark, it's at the end of the handlebar. So we need to figure out where to cut the housing now that we have it marked to the edge of the handlebar. So we take our internal throttle housing, and we know that this is going to sit all the way inside of the handlebar to where it has that step. And then also it has this aluminum piece that has a counterbore that the housing actually snaps into. Well, that counterbore, when this little top hat sits flush on top of the housing, that counterbore ends up being to the surface of the internal throttle housing. So if you just measure from the flat to the face of the end of the housing and cut that much off of your housing from the line that you marked, it'll end up to be the proper length to fit everything that you have going on here. So the shaft on the housing is 1.5 inches long, so we're going to add that to material to be removed off of the housing. So I'm going off of my mark, and I'm just going to move it 1.5 inches over. And now that's where I need to cut from. When you cut a cable, you shouldn't use wire cutters because you don't want to smash the steel sleeve that's inside the housing. You want to use a cutoff wheel and then just clean off the burrs. And depending on the cable that you use, sometimes it's good practice to just put a little bit of electrical tape on the end just so it doesn't fray or the plastic just start peeling away. right, now that we have this cut, you want to just clean up the inside as best you can so that the internal part of the cable, I guess the wire of the throttle cable, is going to pass through the housing. And one thing I should mention, you want to leave the brass ferrule on and cut the part of the cable that doesn't have the ferrule. So now that we have the housing of the throttle cable cut and fit inside the handlebars, we need to figure out where to cut the cable itself to fit inside the slide of the internal throttle housing. To figure out how long to cut the cable, we have to measure a few things. So I'm going to try to go slow to make this as easy to grasp as possible. So first thing, we need to take the slide out of the housing. It's just this bolt. It's a tiny little screw, and then it's got a couple bearings on it just for the slide. So we're going to remove that, and it'd be nice to do it over something that's going to be a catch-all so you don't lose your parts when you're taking this apart. So you have the two little bearings. We're going to put that here and take out the slide. And so now we have the slide out. We're going to measure how far in the cable is actually going to go into the slide. So we can just, whatever will fit inside there, you stick it all the way till it bottoms out, and you can grab it with your fingers what the excess is and take your ruler, and we're at a 1/2 inch. That's how far that the cable, that's going to be where the cable stops inside the slide. So if we go back to the slide and measure the face, a 1/2 inch is right at the line from the plastic neoprene of the slide. So now we have this really nice line that we can work off of for dimensioning how far in to cut the cable. So now we need to just put this back, tighten back up your set screw so that it'll slide inside the housing. You're going to slide it back inside the housing. Put your other screw that holds the bearings on. I'm going to fit this all back together. There's tiny little parts, tiny little set screws. It's nice to work over some kind of bowl or something that catches this so it doesn't go flying across the shop when it falls apart. Okay, so now we know that the cable can go past the face of this slide to that edge. Let's measure to give us another measurement. From the edge of that to the face of that bearing, we're going to say is 3/16. So this pushed all the way in. If we measure from the lip of the housing to the edge of that bearing, I'm going to call that 3/16. So now we know that if we put the housing if we cut that to the edge of this surface here, now the cable just needs to extend to this lip, which we already determined was 1.5 inches. So if we just hold the housing and measure 1.5 inches of cable, it'll be the right length to slip inside the slide and tighten up. Math. Hopefully you followed that. All right, now let's get this thing on the bike. So now we're going to measure to cut the throttle cable. And remember, you have a little bit of play in this. It doesn't have to be super exact because you do have the adjuster on the cable, which is what it's there for. It's better to be a little bit long than a little too short. Remember that, because you can always cut twice. You can't add more cable. To keep this cable from fraying all over the place, it's good practice to put a little tape on it. And then, so after you cut this, it's not going to split all over the place. So now we're going to grab our grinder and cut it with a cutoff wheel. Okay, so now we have the cable and the housing cut. We're going to start assembling the internal throttle. So you're going to take the ferrule off the face of the throttle housing, and we're going to slip that over and to the housing of the throttle cable. Now we're actually going to lock the cable into the slide via the set screw. So you're going to stick that in till it bottoms out and have your Allen ready. sure it's in all the way. And now we are going to tighten that up. Make sure that it's not going to pull out. So the next thing is going to be put the slide in the housing, and we're going to slide that in. And this might be a little tricky. Once it gets through, you can grab it. Okay, so we just grab the slide, pull it through the housing, and then we have the tiny little screw with the little bearings on it. And we're going to stick that in there and screw that into place. A little tricky, and just be careful not to drop it when it's on the side of your bike and this thing's spinning around a little bit. Might be a little difficult to get started, but hey, you wanted an internal throttle. Here we go, getting that in there, and we already tightened up the set screw on the cable, so now we just need to tighten up the one on the ferrule that is the stop for the housing, which should really never fall off because there should always just be tension on the housing, but better tighten it up anyways. So tighten that up. Now we're going to slip that inside, and we're actually going to bolt the housing to the handlebar. So since we went the cool guy route of hiding the screw at the bottom, it's a little tricky to clock this in properly. The last part about assembling your pieces on your handlebars is to put the spiral on and bolt this on from the back side. So you have your aluminum machine bolt, and then that slips in through the end of the handlebar, and that bolts your spiral onto the end of the handlebar, which keeps the grip from falling off. Go. And the last thing you want to do is adjust the end play out of your cable with the adjuster that's on the housing right by the carburetor. And you just turn that out until you don't really have any backlash on the grip. And that's it. If you feel like this is out too far, you just might take this back apart and trim a little bit more off your cable, and you should be good to go. So we've got the cable all ran, and this bike isn't finished yet, but when it's going to be going back together, we're going to have this zip tied to the bar or held down in some kind of way, just so it's not hanging out in the middle of nowhere to get snagged on something or just flopping out there loose. And bikes always look a lot cleaner when the cables are held down by stuff. Now that we got the cable all working, the last thing to do, put your grips back on, levers, and your air cleaner. And if you like this video, please follow more at lowbrowcustoms.com.